We've built an entire ecosystem around carbon accounting. But methane, roughly 80 times more potent than CO2 over 20 years, is still treated like a side quest. No one really cares about it these days. The uncomfortable question is this: if we can see methane from space, why is it still leaking? To find out, I'm sitting down with Abhi Desai, founding partner at Desai Ventures, an Indian family office. We'll unpack how to build systems for methane reduction. Let's dive in. My name is Hugo Roche. I'm an early stage climate tech investor at Climate Club. Welcome. Before we start, I'd like to say thank you to EXA and their Climate Acceleration Program for having us in their studio. Reach out to Max and Bruce if you want to learn more. All right, Abhi, we have to talk methane.
Yes.
So the first thing that came to mind when you suggested this topic was, why did we just focus on CO2 as this, only thing that needs to be removed from the atmosphere?
Sure. Well, because part of it is that methane is quite hard to see and quantify. You know, CO2 is the main culprit, so to speak, but the main kind of vector through which climate change takes place, or the main greenhouse gas. Methane is significant, but its quantities are far less. That's because, as you may be aware, methane is a lot more potent. It has a global warming potential of 80x CO2 on a 20-year timescale. So, in the short term, it's actually probably one of the vectors that is the most effective in reducing short-term warming. But because the quantity is lower and it's hard to detect until recently, as we're finding out, it hasn't gotten that much attention.
And so when you say it's hard to detect, I would assume that CO2 is also hard to detect. We're in a room, there is CO2 and methane most probably, but we don't see it. Like, what's the difference?
That's a very key question, actually. I should say it's hard to detect because we need to detect it. CO2 is such that the daily processes that take place that form the bedrock of society already release a lot of CO2. Methane, there are also such processes, but a lot of the source of methane isn't quite as continuous. It is discrete in the sense that natural gas extraction, for example, you're extracting a lot of oil and gas, and they're often found together. And the gas is not that valuable when it's just a little bit when you're extracting oil, and so it gets vented. Or landfills that are a significant source of methane have a full cover on them. But then again, when they sometimes have leaks, one of the very interesting sources is agriculture. There's cows and other animals that you use enteric fermentation that release methane through their bodily kind of emissions. And rice paddies, which is very interesting because that is an extremely diffuse source of emissions, but when put together, it is quite significant.
It's interesting because from what I understand is from you, it's basically we avoided it so far because CO2 was easier to understand and track. Is that the correct assumption?
Yes. So we've not focused on methane as much because almost everything, everywhere, there's an opportunity to reduce CO2, and we need to reinvent a lot of things. Methane, as we'll go into it, you have to detect discrete events of methane releases to find
Mm.
them, which has been proven hard thus far.
And do you think that some industries have benefited from that focus on CO2 rather than methane? Because if I think about it, I'm like, there are probably some companies and industries where people have kind of quietly hidden the methane emissions and we're like, oh, we're good with it. That doesn't exist, push it to the side.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no secret in climate regulations and climate in general. The oil and gas industry is a behemoth and is well known that the lobbying effect of the oil and gas industry has significantly driven where we put our attention in terms of emissions reduction, both in terms of action and technology and regulations. And so, oil and gas is a significant source of methane. Unlike CO2, where oil and gas gets pointed to partly because of what are called scope 3 emissions. So, not the emissions that their operations conduct, but the emissions that are a result of the use of their product, namely fossil fuels. There they can say, oh, it's not our operations. Obviously, the world needs to run on fossil fuels, which is partly true. But their operations are also a source of CO2. What they're also a very important source of is methane emissions. This flaring that or venting that I mentioned, sometimes it's flared and the methane has a little bit less effect because it's burned into CO2 whilst producing heat. Oftentimes it's just vented, and that's a significant source of methane.
When we think about methane, is it considered as a CO2 equivalent today?
So the way you measure methane is for that matter, in any greenhouse gas, is in a metric that we call CO2e. The E stands for equivalent. So the person who's doing the analysis will pick a time frame for global warming potential, whether it's 20 years or 80 years or 100 years as is relevant, and they'll convert any greenhouse gas, whether it be methane or F gases, HF6, etc., into CO2e.
Okay. Why are we talking about it today then? What has changed recently?
So, few things have changed recently. I'd say, I'm not an expert on pointing to regulations, but there is more action today on methane and more sense of urgency on reducing short-term warming. One of the primary vectors for which is reducing methane than there is before. But one of the very interesting changes that have come in the last few years is a technological one. There's some satellites now operating for a few years, which you may heard of. There's projects like Methane Sat that unfortunately went down last year. There's one called Carbon Mapper. And there's also a few satellites that aren't dedicated methane satellites, but have some ability to detect methane. Now, these satellites have been very useful. Some of them are run by government programs to pinpoint what we call super emitters. These tend to be oil and gas extraction facilities that are venting and or otherwise releasing an awful lot of methane, which was invisible because unlike CO2, it's not just a part of operating a car that methane is released. It's depends really a lot on the kind of site you're on, the kind of operations you have. And there's been quite a lot of analysis and quite a lot of, frankly, naming and shaming that's been done in the past few years, partly by analysis done by The Guardian, which was quite impactful, that coordinated with some companies to say, here, this is the site in this facility in this country is releasing these many thousands of tons of methane.
Okay, so if we want to fix a problem with methane, I think we are going back a few steps versus where we are on CO2 now, which is like the first thing that we have to do properly is measure it, which we, as you said, so far we were not able to do. Is that a correct assumption of like where we are or correct statement of where we are right now in the methane kind of journey to like removing it?
So, yes and no, in that we're going back a step to measuring it so that we're aware of how much is happening where. We didn't take that step necessarily always in CO2 because you don't need to measure it to specifically to understand where and how much CO2 is coming from. In methane, you do.
Why? Why is the difference?
So, CO2 is fundamentally connected to energy, right? You're generating a certain amount of energy, you're using a certain amount of energy. The system that you have has a certain amount of efficiency. Hence, the primary vector of CO2 is combustion. And you know how much fossil fuel you're using, you know how much CO2 you're emitting.
So math work, basically.
Yeah, math works. Even if you take a non kind of typical fossil fuel example, you're making cement, you know the efficiencies of the carbonation or, calcium carbonate breaking down into calcium oxide, et cetera. You know how much CO2 you're releasing. So the math works as you put it.
Okay, that doesn't work for methane. Why? What is the difference there? Is it because it's not as a result of something we do specifically?
It is a result of what something we do, but not something we always intend to do, right? So, for example, you have a gas pipeline and you're transporting a bunch of natural gas across a long distance. Leaks are a fact of, you know, life, and they're a fact of most logistical systems. So the leak is unintended. Or let's say you have a landfill and you're collecting, actually, natural gases, biogas is valuable in landfills. And so in many big ones, it's collected. But you're not really in the business always of detecting how much you lost or how much leaked out.
The good thing there actually is, if I think about it from an investment perspective and even just to fix a problem, you have a clear incentive as to why you want to fix leakage.
Right.
Because leakage is basically money out in the atmosphere for those companies. So they actually, from the get go, want to reduce it versus CO2, which wasn't always the case, right?
That is true. It works in two ways. So, yes, you are right in terms of where that natural gas is collected and monetized and used. That incentive works. Landfills have many big ones have significant renewable natural gas process, collection and processing facilities where the amount of natural gas that would leak is probably irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Oil and gas, that is, you may think so because it's their business, right? But that's unfortunately not always the case because the amount of methane that's releasing is it relevant to the top line of the company? Also, sometimes these fossil fuels are created in pressurized zones in the Earth's crust together. So sometimes you're really digging for oil, but you have some gas, and that's not what you're set to monetize. And another one, actually, just to think of the other ones, agriculture, you're not monetizing it at all. You're not, care about how much methane the farmer doesn't really care or is going off his rice paddy field.
Okay, so how do we go from there?
So now that we know where it is coming from significantly, right? We are pinpointing and naming and shaming super emitters. And the buck is now going to has gone to the regulators a bit, and the EU has really acted. It has put in place rules for these oil and gas companies to really reduce their emissions. Similar things are in place somewhat in the US, where for landfills, for example, they have to do quarterly walks to figure out if any methane is leaking. Unfortunately, because of the current political climate, they had a waste emissions charge coming in that has been rescinded. But awareness is still there in North America and Canada for sure, and at some state levels as well. But the regulations in this space, I'm afraid, are actually sometimes a bit ahead of the technology that's been deployed. Or maybe they're not yet, but in a couple of years, if we don't deploy the right technology, they will be ahead. So regulations are stepping up. So I wouldn't say necessarily they're unfair to anyone yet, but the satellites that I talked about, great at pointing out super emitters, not as great as actionable intelligence for the entire industry.
Okay, let's explore the difference there because if I try to understand what you're saying, we have a satellite that's basically able to measure exactly where the methane is coming from. Like the basic kind of thought process would be we know where it's happening, regulation puts a price on it, and then someone goes and captures it, and then we're good. Like we've done it with direct air capture, it works, doesn't work perfectly, but kind of. So, what's the difference in what you're saying between intelligence and just naming and shaming?
So, very important question, right? There's a few dimensions here. There's resolution. One, what you get at a kilometer or hundreds of meter scale is not what you can find out where the leak is exactly coming from at a few meter scale, for example. What equipment, for example, do I need to fix if that was a leak? If there was an operational practice, sure, there can be better operational practices that can be enforced, but especially in the case of leaks, you need higher resolution. You also need, in order to make a change and figure out that change work, a higher frequency of data. When these satellites are going around and mainly finding out which big leak has occurred and kind of saying, yes, there's a leak occurring here, well, the person on the ground needs to know, okay, can you give me more data now that I've revised this? Can you give me more data now that I've revised this? And then even continuously is also useful because let's say it was a leak issue and you fixed it, but let's say it's not a leak issue. Let's say it's something that's going to happen and you need to quantify it. If someone wants to fine you, they need to know how much you released. And so there, especially if it's leaks, it's very discreet. Unless you have continuous monitoring, you're not going to know that it was leaked. And if it was leaked and you need to know, you want to find them, you need to know partly maybe how much was leaked.
Hmm.
So resolution, frequency, and detection does not equal quantification.
Okay, and can we do that with satellites?
So there's a few technologies here I'd like to maybe talk about because yes, satellites certainly play a role, but there's several different technologies. I'll go for a bit longer here, but talk about a couple of them, and then you can ask me specifically about some. So one of the technologies that we've invested in is on a drone mounted platform that runs a hose from a drone on to close to the surface of the landfill to really take samples very close to surface, have a defined flat fly path over the landfill, and just detect leaks. This is actually out in the US, they're trying to mimic what the regulations already do, which is they require a person to walk on a landfill every quarter and figure out where the leaks are. So the only EP authorized non-manual method to detect it. There's a company called Sniffer Robotics. Another method is actually one where you define a path through which, if methane passes, then the laser that you point in that path has slightly different wavelength variation. Interestingly, that's the same concept NASA uses to detect life on other planets, but essentially, if there's a gas present there, the wavelength will vary. And so, if you define a certain path, you throw the laser and it bounces back, you can detect methane leaks. A company called Trellisense that we've invested in is doing it out in the US. They're looking at landfills, oil and gas, but very interestingly, they can actually get sensitivity enough to find out what the concentration of methane is that's leaked, not only in ppm, but possibly also in ppb. Those acronyms I'll say is parts per million and parts per billion. It needs quite a bit more sensitivity, which is super useful when you're talking about diffuse emissions in places like agriculture. Now, lastly, you mentioned satellite. So we even recently invested in a very interesting company called Airmo in Germany. They do have some next generation satellite tech that's not only doing the sphere technology that detects methane usually, but they're also developing what they call micro lidar that helps detect aerosol emissions between the source of the methane and your satellite, which you can then remove as error and hence get a much more accurate reading. And they're doing this on low Earth orbit satellites, which gets you far better resolution. So, yes, they're satellites, but different satellites have different resolutions and you can get different tech to be more accurate.
How does, if I think about those companies, how do they make money? Because great, no, they're able to identify where we have methane. Who cares, really? Like, if I put myself into the shoes of someone that doesn't care about the climate, who cares?
So, it's twofold: one, regulation, and two, what you mentioned earlier, which is the value of lost gas. And a third one, which I'll get to, is a one that's coming up. So, let's say regulations. I'll take the example of landfills. You have a requirement in lots of parts of the world to detect gas leaks off of landfills. This is important not just from a climate perspective, but oftentimes these landfills are in cities. Methane, sure, at certain quantities is fine, at larger it's not fine. Sulfur dioxide, or sorry, hydrogen sulfide, one of the gases that can smell like eggs and can be a significant issue. So gas leaks in landfills are something that's regulated. You need to anyway detect those leaks. So there it's a no-brainer. You can either have a person walk your site 4 feet off the ground and walk your entire acres and acres, or you can put a drone and define a flight path and do it yourself, remotely. But that's not the only reason. Like you pointed out, those there's value in that biogas. So the collection sites that are facilities that are established at landfills to collect them are collecting all the gas, but they might also have leaks, and they often do. So if you use this platform to kind of detect the leaks, and especially if you're able to quantify it, then you can tell the owners, look, you're losing this much value. And that is something precisely, especially for the facilities where that lost gas is a significant amount relative to what they're collecting. That's a fact that matters. The last one I say is coming up because it isn't quite established yet in the methane world is carbon credits. Whether they're voluntary or BARDA compliance market, reducing methane emissions is super important and super potent in terms of, because it's such a potent gas, you can reduce emissions by much lower amount than you reduce CO2 emissions, but get a more CO2 equivalent credit. So the math works backwards for the people who are trying to make credits. And if you're able to, for example, reduce them in agriculture, there's companies now you may be familiar with that are trying to make feed for cows that makes them release less methane. There's companies that are trying to detect farmer practices that would result in less methane emissions from rice paddy fields. So these ways, there's still development happening in kind of making sure those processes are well validated, but you can create carbon credits from that as well.
The first thing someone told me when I started to be a climate investor was never rely on regulation as a business case. I want to go a little bit deeper on this one because Well, I understand that it's a requirement today to measure how much gases are leaked. Or, for example, for farmers, let's maybe take that example for farmers. Why would you want to reduce the methane that your cows are producing? I do get it that carbon credit might be coming, but still, that is a market that relies, or at least like the compliance market relies on regulation, right? So, like, how do we play with this to make a great business case? How do we build a conviction?
You're right. The farmer doesn't inherently care. In some cases, I will say that the farmers and the developers that are generating carbon credits aren't necessarily the people who care about generating the credits. And that's the purpose of credits. The farmer may not care, but if the money that comes from those credits is material, then that will move the needle. But separately, I think you're right. You're not gonna get all of it done by just reducing the purpose, sole purpose being reducing emissions. So, whilst this is still very much in the works, and we need to see which one works well, if you see some of the solutions that are being suggested for reducing emissions from cows or other cattle, performance and productivity of those animals is being targeted along with the kind of methane reduction. Ultimately, you're trying to affect their biology. You're trying to affect the way they digest food. You're trying and you're making a some sort of a, not in necessarily hormonal, but some sort of biological intervention. And that's an opportunity to increase productivity as well, in terms of if it's productivity of the cow and how much energy it can extract from the food, then maybe it needs less feed. Or if it's a milk producing cow, if they can produce more milk partly because of the additive that you have reduced methane, then that's an incentive for farmers as well.
Okay, so the methane business case is always related to something else. Can't be alone, basically.
Yeah, unless you're generating credits and your focus is simply methane and CO2e, it is often related to other stuff, except I'll say, again, going back to granted your point about the regulations, but when you're in the oil and gas world or the landfill world, it's about stopping methane leaks very
Mhm.
categorically.
If we think about the carbon credits, I like what you were saying, which is like methane has an 80x worst impact on the climate than CO2. Does that translate to a 80x higher price per ton in the credit world?
Not yet, I don't think, because there's so ATX is a powerful notion because it communicates how much it is affecting our environment and the end result. But there isn't quite the consensus on it in terms of monetizing it. So just a little bit going back to kind of global warming basics, methane once it's released in a period of I believe 12 or so years will break down into CO2,
Okay.
which means it's much more potent than CO2 as a gas in the radiative forcing it has, which is the process that increases the temperature of the earth. However, its relative potency relative to CO2 decreases the longer the period you measure it over, which is why methane is called a very potent short term vector for reducing climate change. But the GWP 20, which is the 20-year global warming potential, is 80 or precisely 84x, whereas the GWP 100, or global warming potential over 100 years, is 20x. So navigating these nuances and accurately, measuring the emissions of a gas that we're still developing the best and cheapest technology to detect is not quite as standard as making sure you're burning a little less fuel that'll generate the CO2 credit. And so the processes we need, the validation and the methods we need to accurately quantify that is more still in the works.
Okay. Um, on methane, so far you're telling me satellites, for example, which I know cost a lot of money to put in the atmosphere. Is that effective? Is that a great solution to actually visualize or like understand how much methane is leaking?
Yes, it's actually quite effective. I think we're getting there in terms of the accuracy and sensitivity of the technologies. What the path ahead is partly about is actually costing them down, such that the users can make it work economically for them, and the companies that are offering it can actually make it worth their money to launch satellites
Mhm.
to do methane detection. The company that we invested in, Airmo, is planning to launch a 12 satellite constellation. When you have 12 satellites, that's 3 satellites per orbit, you can not only cover everywhere in the Earth, but you can get a higher revisitation rate such that it's, economic to get data everywhere and get data everywhere often. So that in the satellite terms is one way you can actually get the cost down such that you can make this cost effective. Um, in all there are such parallels in all technologies where the company we've invested in TrelliSense is actually trying to make a few longer paths and cost down the sensors. One interesting approach they've taken is rather than shooting a laser and back to detect methane emissions, can you use the sun's rays and actually move the sensor across the top of an oil and gas site to detect methane as the sun moves? So there's various approaches being taken, but definitely the name of the game in the next few years is getting adoption and costing down.
So in other words, if it costs more money to detect the methane leakage than it costs to fix it, or like to compared to the revenue you could make if it wasn't leaking, that's where we want to get to, right? Which is like it makes so much sense to fix it because you know exactly how much money you're gonna make. That's the idea behind it.
Yeah, highlight the money that you can make if you fix it.
At a lower cost than the money that you can make, basically.
Absolutely.
Okay, interesting. Well, look, another topic I wanted to dive into today is you're a solo GP. You run your own fund or family office. How do we think about those technical topics like methane, for example? How much did you knew about satellite before and lasers? Those are very difficult topic to understand.
Yeah, for sure. I will say I have a technical background that helps. I have a degree in mechanical engineering, and I did a master's in climate change management and finance, which enables me to understand the climate issues pretty well. But look, all of these technologies, by virtue of being cutting edge deep tech, are extremely novel, sometimes in their use cases, but oftentimes in the fundamental science. And it takes quite a bit of deep dive to really understand different tech actually compared to what we know and use in the world and figure out what is novel. My process in that is really just diving deep into it. I, will assess a deck, have a call with the founder to ask the macro questions. One of my qualifying criteria is what the potential impact or the emissions reduction potential. I need to understand that this kind of solution in the problem space they're tackling is big enough to make an impact. Once I, talk to the founders, assess the technology a bit, and understand, validate that the emissions reduction potential is big enough, then their data room assessment is where it all lies. I'll probably spend a week or an entire weekend just deep diving in a data room, looking through the deep technical matters. LLMs are sometimes a useful tool these days in assessing patents, for example. It's a long, heavy document. And then I'll write down all the questions. And those usually run 2 to 3 pages at least in terms of going into each topic. And I'll do that process a couple of times with the founder to make sure that I am satisfied with the level of knowledge that I have about the product. One of the things I do sometimes is I'll get an expert on board. So I'll reach out to hire an expert for a couple of hours to really get a sense of the specific industry and their expertise.
Has it been useful in the past? Have you passed on a deal because the expert told you like this technology is never going to work?
Yes, I have. So it has been quite useful. I have passed on a deal because that technology wasn't, there were other solutions that were more effective. I've actually also passed on a follow-on deal because the expert could understand that the technology hadn't developed as much since the last time we invested.
You talked about technology novelty and emission reduction potential as two main criteria that you use for investing. I want to stop on emission reduction potential. If a generalist VC is listening to that, they're going to be like, okay, why is he caring about that? Is that a proxy for how much revenue you can make?
Yeah. Uh, This is not philanthropy, as I heard you say in a recent podcast. This is making money in VC, right? We are investing in solutions where the revenue that the company will generate is going to be proportional to the impact they're going to make. So, yes, we are, as an industry, a climate VC, and we are prioritizing high impact solutions, but that doesn't mean that's impact at the cost of money.
I love that. Well, look, to finish this episode, you're a family office and we want to incentivize as many people to care and invest in climate as possible. You do have the particularity of having a technical background that allows you to understand a bit more what's happening in the climate sense. How do we encourage more people to do that? Because I can't really imagine people hiring experts and spending 1 week in the data room. And, like it's just a complicated process. If we just don't make it easier, then it's not going to work. So, how do we do that?
Absolutely. It's a rigorous process and deep tech is not easy. And there are VC firms who will have huge dedicated teams and PhDs on board, and that's really helpful and thorough and gets them to invest in a lot of different industries. One thing I found is climate tech VC, especially deep tech, is a setting where a collaborative approach can be really useful. This is not B2B SaaS where one VC is gonna come up and take the round and that's gonna be your backer for the next while. A lot of the rounds, especially what I'm seeing in early stage, are heavily syndicated. There's a VC that'll do maybe just 40% or even 30% of the round, set the terms, and there's a lot of follow investors. One thing we've noticed is in the last few years, as the climate tech boom of the early 20s has unfortunately come off, there's fewer climate tourists, so to speak, VCs that are investing only one or two deals in climate. And that's what we need to get more of. How do we get more of that? I think really in the deep tech world, one of the ways to do that is sharing and being more collaborative in due diligence. I'll give a couple of examples of what that means. In two instances that I remember, we went through all our DD process, wrote a condensed kind of due diligence report, and shared it with the founder to really pass it on to potential investors. I've had a few calls with potential investors as well, share our insights. Doesn't take anything away from us. We actually get to close the round that we were interested in. And I've seen this happen the other way around as well. I've signed one or two non-reliance agreements where the VC firm knows contractually that they are not liable just because I read their due diligence, but they're willing to share it with me because they have experts that have looked into that particular space. And that's been quite helpful in spaces like biology or battery chemistry where I don't have that expertise.
Are you never afraid of losing a deal because of that?
Not particularly, frankly, because the same process that gives me confidence in the founder and their team, I've found often gives the founder confidence in my participation. It's the insight of those questions that they want, not just in the investment process, but oftentimes ongoingly in terms of advising them as founders that has, in my bit of experience, gotten me to get some allocation.
Great. You've just finally deployed everything you had to deploy in climate tech, at least in the first fund or allocation. I don't know how we call it in the
Yeah.
family office. What's next for you?
Well, I'll soon announce this. We've announced our first 10 deals that we did in 10, 22, 23. We've now deployed a total of $5 million, including 12 more companies that we've invested in. What's next is really supporting our founders. Because right now, as you pointed out, I'm by myself trying to invest in these companies, but also being there to support them. Of the 22 companies, I'm on half their boards in some capacity and trying to help them any way I can. So right now, my time is going to be taken up by that, but we'll figure out what comes next.
Sounds great. Well, so if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way?
LinkedIn is best.
Okay, perfect. And then the last question I always have is who should be next for an interview to talk about climate tech and investment?
I'm just coming off of a board meeting at 360 Capital here in Paris, so I'll give a shout out to Alexandra Mordak.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, if listeners, if you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube or to give us a follow and a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Abhi, thank you so much.
Thank you.